In the 7th year of Julia Fenner's marriage to Colonel Everett Warden, she carried her family papers to the housing office to buy a subsidized faculty apartment, and was told the record in her hand was a forgery. How could that be possible? Certain the clerk had made a mistake, Julia politely asked her to check again. My husband transferred my records after we married. The clerk checked the county and military family registry again, her patience visibly thinning, and looked at Julia with something close to scorn. There's no mistake. Everett Warden's lawful record lists 2 other people, his wife, Lydia Warden, and their son Peter. Julia Fenner sat frozen before the counter, her head buzzing as if a knot of wire were rolling around inside it, tightening with every turn. Lydia Warden? Wasn't she supposed to be the widow of one of Everett's men? Why was she listed as his wife? Julia read the record the clerk had turned toward her one more time. Wife, Lydia Warden. Son, Peter Warden. Julia's name did not appear anywhere on Everett's dependent record with the army. She left the housing office in a daze and went to the address the clerk had given her, the residence listed on Everett's dependent record. She could not make herself approach the door. From outside the yard, she heard warm laughter filling the house. Everett handed the boy a large bag of candy. Look what Dad brought you. Peter jumped up and wrapped his arms around Everett's neck. I love you, Dad. Lydia emerged from the kitchen smiling. Wash your hands. Dinner is ready. The scene inside was warm and complete, while Julia felt frozen to the bone. Unable to bear another second, she fled. The sun had been down for hours by the time she returned home. Nora Dawson, the housekeeper, hurried to meet her. Ms. Fenner, thank goodness you're back. Colonel Warden has called several times. He was frantic when no one knew where you were. Please call him before he worries himself sick. Julia lifted her head blankly. The telephone rang before she responded, and Mrs. Dawson answered. It was Everett. Colonel, Miss Fenner just came in. Yes, I'll put her on. The instant Everett's voice reached her through the receiver, Julia could no longer hold back her tears. He noticed immediately. What's wrong, Jules? Did you miss me? I'll ask the general for leave tomorrow and come home. Before that day, the promise would have delighted her. She would have admitted that she missed him with her whole heart. They had been married 7 years, yet Everett came home only on summer and winter leave. Whenever Julia asked to live near Fort Ashcombe, he insisted the conditions were too harsh. She had never imagined he was legally married elsewhere, or that the marriage certificate and household papers he gave her were forged. Life near the base is hard, Jules. I couldn't stand watching you suffer there. Wait until I earn my transfer, and then we'll never have to live apart again. Julia had never doubted him or asked a single question. Now she said, don't request leave. I want to apply for family housing near your unit. I already told you, I don't want you living under those conditions. Did something happen? I'll come back tomorrow. His concern did not sound false, yet hearing the answer she had expected made Julia suddenly calm. She wiped her tears. Nothing happened. I think I'm coming down with a cold. Take care of yourself. Ask Mrs. Dawson to make soup. Your students matter, but your health matters more. Take your medicine, and don't make me worry. I'll visit as soon as I can. He sounded as tender as ever. Julia's tears kept falling, and just before the call ended, she heard the boy in the background. Dad, hurry. Mom cut her hand. Everett rushed away without hanging up properly. Julia listened to the open line for a full minute. Then she ended the call, and dialed another number. Professor Amos Bell, I accept the position at Briar Ridge Research Station. Professor Bell's voice became grave. Have you thought this through, Ms. Fenner? Project 403 is a classified appointment. Your public identity will be sealed, and you may have to work under another name for the rest of your life. Julia had never been more certain. The work is urgent, he said at last. You have 2 weeks to settle your affairs. A secured transport team will collect you when the time comes. The next afternoon, Julia submitted her resignation to Walter Harris, the school principal, after classes ended. He valued her deeply. She had taught at Latchford Community School for years, and her students adored her, but he knew he could not force her to remain. None of us wants to lose you, but everyone knows how devoted you and Colonel Warden are. Sooner or later, you were bound to join him near his post. He must hate leaving you alone. I won't stand in your way. Everyone believed Julia and Everett shared an enviable marriage. No one knew the entire thing was a performance built on forged papers. Principal Harris, that isn't why. Everett. He waved with the confidence of someone who thought he understood. I was young once too. Besides, you and the Colonel have been together long enough to start thinking about children. Years earlier, Julia had been badly injured protecting Everett, and with that injury she had lost her chance at motherhood. Everett's relatives had always treated her coldly, but no one had openly blamed her for being unable to continue the family line. She had believed Everett defended her. Now she understood they never complained because he already had a son. Julia stopped trying to explain. A new teacher would take her class. All she needed to do was complete the handover during her remaining days. When Julia left the school, She saw Everett waiting beneath the large tree near the gate. A car stood beside him, with someone sitting inside. Another teacher spotted him and called, "Colonel Warden, here to pick up Miss Fenner?" Everett looked up at once. The moment he saw Julia, he crossed the distance and pulled her into his arms. Classes had just ended, and teachers and students crowded the gate, but no one found the embrace unusual. Whenever Everett returned, he always waited there for Julia. His uniform carried the stale smell of an overnight journey. Once, Julia would have held him tighter because that road-worn scent proved how far he traveled for her. She looked at the dark stubble along his jaw and the shadows beneath his eyes. Her throat closed before she could speak, and tears came first. "What's wrong? Are you still sick? You have to care for yourself when I'm gone. Fall weather changes quickly. The moment I heard you had a cold, I requested leave and drove through the night." Everett wiped her tears in a panic. His warm, dry palms cradled her face, and his gaze overflowed with concern. The love in his eyes felt like a dull blade pressing slowly into her heart. Painful precisely because part of her still wanted to believe it. Until, "You must be Miss Fenner. Everett speaks of you often." Lydia stood just behind his shoulder. Julia went rigid. She could not believe he had dared bring his lawful wife home, and stand her directly in front of her. Everett noticed nothing. He released Julia, stepped beside Lydia, and introduced her. "Jules, this is Lydia. She is the widow of one of my fallen men." "A fallen man's widow?" Julia forced a smile. Before she could respond, Everett's aide, Daniel Chase, ran over and whispered urgently in his ear. Julia watched his face change. He turned to her immediately. "There's an emergency at the unit. Go home without me." He took Lydia by the hand, put her in the car, and left. Everett had lied again. Julia had clearly heard the words hospital and child. She did not know what drove her to follow them. At Latchford County Hospital, she stood outside the room and listened to Everett berate the staff. "He's had a fever for half the day. Why hasn't it broken? And why did it take more than one attempt to place the 4? What kind of care is this?" The head nurse, Mabel Quinn, was Julia's close friend. She frowned at him. "Colonel Warden, stop bullying my staff. The boy fought the needle, and they had to try twice. That does not justify shouting at nurses." "Dad, I feel awful." Tears covered Peter's pale face. Everett's anger vanished. He gathered the boy into his arms and soothed him, while Mabel stared as if the room had tilted beneath her. "Everett, what did that boy just call you?" Fury filled her eyes. "How could you do this to Julia? She was injured saving your life and lost her chance to become a mother. And you built another household behind her back? You brought them into my hospital and expected me not to tell her?" Silence held the room for a moment before Everett answered in a low voice. "Lydia is my lawful wife. If you care about Julia at all, you'll keep this from her. I hid it because I love her, but the Warden family needed an heir. You're her friend. You don't want to destroy her, so you know what shouldn't be said. You're out of your mind. You expect me to help you lie to her. I saw the transfer request involving your father's position. If you want it approved without trouble, you know what to do." Everett's stare was cold enough to silence the rest of Mabel's protest. "Nurse, I know I am not worthy of Everett, but our child is innocent. Please take good care of him." Lydia began to cry, and Everett drew her against him. "No one will neglect my son. And you need to stop thinking only about Peter and care for yourself. I'll have the doctor prescribe something to build your strength. You gave the Warden family its heir. Never say you are unworthy of me again." Julia watched from outside as he held Lydia's face with the same gentle hands that had touched hers at the school gate. He treasured Lydia too. Then what was Julia to him? She staggered backward and knocked a cup from a passing patient's hand. Hot water splashed across the back of her hand, raising an angry red patch. The patient was unharmed and kept asking, "Ma'am, are you all right?" Julia seemed unable to feel the burn. She turned and ran from the hospital without looking back. By the time Julia returned home, blisters had risen across the burn on her hand. Her hollow expression frightened Mrs. Dawson. "Miss Fenner, what happened? That burn needs treatment. I'll call Colonel Warden." The housekeeper reached for the telephone. Julia stopped her. "Please don't. Just put some burn ointment on it. You don't want to worry him, do you? He normally returns every 6 months, but this time it has only been 2. He must have come because he heard you were ill. If he sees this burn, he'll be beside himself." Mrs. Dawson brought the ointment and applied it carefully. "Am I pressing too hard? Does it hurt?" Everyone believed Everett loved Julia completely. No one knew his devotion was divided between 2 women. Julia touched her cheek with her uninjured hand, and discovered it wet with tears. She wiped them away and forced a smile. "Thank you. It doesn't hurt." After Mrs. Dawson left, Julia began packing and realized how little of Everett actually existed inside the house. He stayed only briefly each year. A few uniforms remained in the closet, along with photographs of the 2 of them on her dresser. There was almost nothing else. The warning signs had always been there. She had simply trusted him too completely to see them. Everett did not return that night. Julia tossed until well after midnight before sleep finally came. The next morning, noise in the living room woke her. Expecting Mrs. Dawson, she entered to find Lydia and Peter inside her home. Peter stood on a chair reaching for a small wooden train on the cabinet, the only keepsake Julia still had from her parents. "Don't touch that," Julia shouted. The boy startled but refused to release it. Lydia lifted him down and placed him on the floor. "Miss Fenner, Peter and I will be staying here for a while." Lydia smiled, but no warmth reached her eyes. Julia ignored her and walked directly to Peter. "Give it back." He hid both hands behind him and lifted his chin. "I found it, so it's mine." "You wouldn't fight a child over one little toy, would you?" He's curious. If Everett were here, he would let his son have it. "You already know Peter belongs to him, don't you?" Julia gave Lydia one cold glance and reached for the train. Lydia understood from her silence that the secret was already exposed. "So you truly know. Yet you still refuse to leave Everett. Today I'll show you who matters more to him." Lydia shoved Peter hard enough to send him to the floor, and the boy began screaming. What happened? Everett appeared in the doorway carrying a suitcase. Seeing Peter on the floor, he crossed the room and lifted him at once. "Everett, don't blame Miss Fenner. This is our fault. I failed to teach Peter not to grab what belongs to someone else." Lydia snatched the train from his hands. "Ms. Fenner, he's young and doesn't understand. Here." Julia wanted only the keepsake and ignored Lydia's performance. As she reached for it, Lydia released the train before their hands met. It struck the floor and shattered. It was the only object Julia's parents had left her. She dropped to her knees and gathered the broken pieces. Splinters covered the floor, and there was no way to restore it. "You attacked a small child over a wooden toy?" Everett asked coldly. Julia rose and met his eyes. "A wooden toy? Everyone else may be ignorant, but you knew it was the only thing I had from my parents." Everett faltered. Lydia wrapped both hands around his arm and filled her eyes with tears. "I didn't know it mattered so much. This is my fault and Peter's. We should never have come. Don't be angry with Miss Fenner. We'll leave." She pretended to turn away, but Everett caught her immediately. Guilt entered his eyes as he faced Julia. "Peter is ill. Let them stay for a few days. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I'll build you another train." "All right." Julia almost laughed, yet her eyes burned. "Fine. They can stay as long as they like. I'm leaving soon anyway." She placed the fragments carefully inside a cloth bag and turned away. Everett seized her wrist and searched her face. "Where are you going?" Everett's grip tightened when Julia tried to pull away. He refused to release her and stared into her eyes. "Where are you going?" "Let go. I need to." She struggled, but the suitcase belonging to Lydia and Peter remained in Everett's other hand, and the truth nearly escaped her. Lydia placed one hand over Everett's and pinched Julia's arm lightly with the other. At that small touch, Everett loosened his grip. "Everett, don't hold Miss Fenner so hard. She must be going to school. Don't worry. I'll replace whatever Peter broke." "Don't bother," Julia said coldly. She shook Lydia's hand away and left the house. She told herself again and again not to care, yet her mind kept replaying the intimate sight of Lydia's hand resting over Everett's. The memory made acid rise in Julia's stomach. Fighting the nausea, she organized her class's progress and recorded every detail in a notebook. She was leaving, but she still wanted to make the transition easy for her students. That afternoon, she entered the classroom intending to tell them she had resigned. Before she could begin, Principal Harris knocked and interrupted. "Miss Fenner, this boy will sit in your class for several days. Colonel Warden said he's a distant relative. I assume he already told you." The chalk snapped in Julia's fingers. The faint scrape against her nails seemed deafening after the principal's words. Everett had told her nothing. Perhaps he believed his disguise was perfect. It was not enough to bring the boy into Julia's home. Now he had placed him inside her classroom. Did he truly believe she was a fool? Principal Harris led Peter to an empty desk at the back. Julia used every ounce of restraint she had left. This was a school, and Peter was a student. Julia turned away, closed her eyes for one hard second, then faced the board and began the lesson as though nothing had happened. Peter disrupted the class repeatedly. Julia limited herself to verbal warnings until, near dismissal, he cut a lock of hair from the girl sitting in front of him. "Peter, come to my office." School had ended, and the office was empty except for Julia and the boy. For the first time, she studied him carefully. He had Everett's height and build. Even at 6, he seemed older than the other children, and his eyes and brow were unmistakably Everett's. Julia drew a deep breath and reminded herself that a child was not responsible for his father's betrayal. "Tomorrow, ask your mother to move you to a lower grade. This is 3rd grade, and at 6 you cannot keep up." Peter stared at her. "You're the one who's 6. I'm 8. The pages beneath Julia's hand fluttered in the breeze. She thought she had misheard and asked again. 8? I'm 8. Peter spotted Lydia entering the office and ran toward her happily. Lydia examined him, then walked to Julia's desk. "Miss Fenner, Peter has been difficult. I'll discipline him. She picked up a wooden ruler and struck him several times. Peter howled, while Julia heard only the words "I'm 8," repeating as old memories raced through her mind. When Everett proposed, he knelt before her and said, "Jules, I will cherish you, love you, and respect you for the rest of my life. Marry me." When she woke in the hospital after taking a knife meant for him, his eyes had been full of pain. "Even if you can never have children, I will never leave you." Every time she asked to live near his post, he held her and promised, "I don't want you suffering there. Once I earn my transfer, we'll never be separated again." The memories dissolved beneath Peter's cries. He was 8. Everett had lied from the beginning, and continued lying for 7 years. Lydia shoved Peter hard enough that he knocked a chair and desk onto Julia's foot. Julia stood abruptly, and a fierce pain tore through her abdomen. She tried to lift the furniture, but Lydia hooked a foot in her path and sent her down. "Miss Fenner, however badly he behaved, you shouldn't beat him." Lydia helped Peter up while crying. "What happened?" Everett rushed into the office. The moment he saw Peter's swelling ankle, he lifted him. "Don't blame Miss Fenner. Peter was unruly. He deserved to be corrected." Julia had never seen anyone turn on a dime like that. She forced herself upright despite the abdominal pain. "Peter, tell him who hit you." The boy's eyes shifted. Then he buried his face against Everett's chest. "Miss Fenner did." Julia stared at him. "That's a lie." "Enough." Everett's voice cracked through the room. "He's a child. Why would he lie?" "Jules, I never imagined you'd treat a student this way. What happened to your integrity as a teacher?" Julia swayed as the pain intensified and her face drained of color. "I never imagined you'd care this much about a dead man's child. Is he really one of your men's son, or is he?" Peter fainted from the pain. "We have to get him to the hospital." Lydia screamed. Everett looked down at the boy's closed eyes and hurried away. As Julia watched his back disappear, another wave of pain brought her to the floor. A teacher entered at that moment, saw her collapsed, and ran to support her. Pain pulsed through Julia's abdomen. She gripped her colleague's sleeve. "Everett, he just left. Please bring him back. I need the hospital." The teacher ran after him. Time had never moved so slowly. When she returned, she was alone. Colonel Warden seemed to have an emergency. He left before I could finish speaking. Julia could no longer remain conscious. Darkness swallowed the office. Julia felt as if she had lived through an endless dream. It began with Everett giving her every tenderness she had ever wanted, and ended with a woman and child proving that all of it was false. Their 7-year marriage was false. Everett's love was false. Every promise from beginning to end was false. She woke to nurses talking in the hallway. "That boy only scraped his ankle. Why does he come back every day for a bandage? He's the son of one of Colonel Warden's men, killed in the line of duty. The colonel dotes on him. He comes in for every dressing change. The mother seems far too attached to the colonel. I don't understand him. The woman he calls his wife is lying here pregnant, and he hasn't visited once. He may not even know she is pregnant." Julia's heart lurched. Her hand moved slowly to her abdomen. She was pregnant? Tears slipped down her cheeks. Once, she had wanted a child more than anything, but now, this child had arrived at the worst possible time. Mabel entered, saw that Julia was awake, and hurried to support her. "Why didn't you press the call button? Does anything still hurt? Is your abdomen cramping?" Mabel arranged pillows behind her, and checked her carefully. Julia looked at her, and remembered what she had overheard at the hospital. She did not blame Mabel for remaining silent. Everett had created this betrayal. "I don't want to continue the pregnancy." Mabel stared at her in shock, but Julia's expression left no doubt. "Your injuries. If you end this pregnancy, you may never have another chance." Julia spoke softly. "Mabel, I know everything. I can't bring his child into this. Don't tell him." Mabel opened her mouth several times, unable to argue. At last, she held Julia's hand. "I'll arrange it." Quietly. Everett did not arrive until that afternoon. He behaved with his familiar attentiveness, watching Julia's every movement. When she tried to sit, he supported her immediately and adjusted the pillows behind her. She barely moved her lips before he poured water, and lifted the glass toward her. No matter what he did now, her heart no longer responded. Mabel came back for her. Seeing Everett in the room, she looked uncomfortable. "Jules, we're ready for you." After she left, Everett's eyelid twitched. "Prepare for what?" Julia did not answer. She moved his hand away calmly. "There is one more examination before discharge." "I'll go with you." The words had barely left him when Lydia rushed into the room looking distressed. "Everett, Peter keeps crying that his ankle hurts. He wants you." Everett hesitated only a moment. "Jules, I'll come back soon." Julia expected nothing from him now. She answered simply, "All right." A vague uneasiness followed Everett to the door. Julia seemed different. He looked back once before leaving. She stood steadily by the window and watched him go. He exhaled in relief. He was imagining things. Julia loved him. That could not change. The abortion was brief. Julia felt as though she had fallen asleep and awakened to discover something gone from her body, as though it had never existed. Everett did not return to the hospital. Julia was discharged alone the next day. The front door stood partly open, and before she entered, she saw Everett and Lydia wrapped around each other. Lydia's breathing came in broken gasps. Everett, it's broad daylight. So what? Peter is at school. What are you afraid of? You're the one who tempted me. Julia stopped, rooted where she stood. Inside, Everett drew Lydia's hand toward his belt and murmured, "Go on." Julia made herself watch, punishing herself with every second of it. Her eyes burned and her chest seized, and still she did not move. Veins stood along Everett's forearms, his ears flushed, and his broad shoulders covered Lydia almost completely. Julia knew every detail of the way he looked when desire overtook him. Remembering the countless nights he had looked at her the same way made Julia violently ill. Her retching interrupted them. Everett pulled his clothes together and hurried to the door, where he found Julia crying and struggling not to vomit. He reached for her shoulder. "What's wrong, Jules? Why aren't you still at the hospital?" The heat of his palm reached through her coat. Julia shuddered and struck his hand away. "Don't touch me. You're disgusting." Her vision darkened, and pressure closed around her chest. Everett caught her before she fell. "Even if you're furious, you have to protect your health. This is my fault, not Lydia's. Now that you've seen us, I won't lie. She has endured a great deal for years. Hit me or curse me if you need to." Julia had imagined this moment. She thought he might beg endlessly, kneel, or plead for forgiveness. She had never imagined this calm entitlement. There may have been guilt in his eyes, but he spoke as though his betrayal were reasonable. Her disappointment became so complete that it left her strangely calm. "Continue. I came for something and still have to go to the school." Her composure irritated him. Everett grabbed her arm. "What else do you want from me? You couldn't give me children, and I still kept this home with you for years. Everyone knows how well I treated you. You're almost 30. Who's going to want you if you leave me? If you love me, why can't you accept the people who matter to me? I made the mistake every man makes. Can't you forgive me once? Of course. You did nothing wrong. This is all my fault. I was blind enough to save you from that knife." The words tore Julia apart even as she spoke them. Seeing the grief in her eyes, Everett regretted lashing out. He softened his voice. "I lost my head. Forgive me, Jules. You're going to school? I'll drive you." Julia ignored him and walked away. Everett followed close behind. Neighbors greeted them with the same familiar praise. "Colonel Warden certainly treasures his wife. He escorts Miss Fenner everywhere." Julia had heard those words for years. Once, they filled her with happiness because the whole town seemed to recognize his love. Now they sounded cruelly ironic. She said nothing on the way. At the school gate, Everett forced an embrace around her. "We'll discuss this tonight. I'll pick you up after classes." No. Julia had come only to complete the transition to the new teacher. She no longer had lessons and spent the day organizing records in the office. Classes had been over for some time when she handed over the final materials. Only 7 days remained before her secured transport would arrive. At the school gate, she looked automatically toward the old tree, then laughed at herself. 7 years, and her body still looked for him without being told. Whenever Everett came home, he had always waited under that tree. As she stood distracted, Lydia appeared suddenly, seized Julia's arm, and dropped to her knees. "Miss Fenner, if you hate me, I'll leave. But you cannot hurt my son. Peter is my whole life." Julia had not even understood Lydia's accusation when Everett hauled Lydia to her feet. Lydia kept trying to kneel, and he had to half carry her away from Julia. "Jules, no matter how angry you are with me, you cannot punish a child. Tell me where Peter is. Lydia will not press charges if he comes back safely." Everett spoke loudly enough for everyone at the school gate to hear. Curious and condemning eyes turned toward Julia, but she ignored them and met his gaze with her head high. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I haven't seen Peter today. Miss Fenner, I know you cannot have children and hate seeing Peter in Everett's home, but he is innocent. Please tell me where you hid him." Lydia broke away from Everett and dug her nails into Julia's arm. Julia stepped back, trying to shake her off, and Everett's mother struck her across the face. "You barren little tramp. It wasn't enough to cling to my son for years? Tell us where you hid my grandson. If he has so much as a scratch, I will make you pay." Estelle Warden's slap knocked Julia to the ground and split her lip. As the older woman stood over her cursing, the crowd's curiosity hardened into disgust, and Julia felt the last warmth leave her heart. "I did not hide him." Everett lowered his eyes and walked toward her. He had barely extended a hand when his aide shouted, "We found him." Everyone turned. The aide carried Peter, whose clothes were covered in yellow mud. Everett crossed the yard, took the boy, and inspected him from head to foot before finally breathing again. Lydia rushed over. "You frightened me to death. Why did you follow a stranger? Tell us who took you." Peter pointed at Julia on the ground. "She did. She locked me up and left me on the ridge. Estelle answered instantly. Take her to the discipline room. A few days alone will teach her to confess. 2 household guards seized Julia and began dragging her away. Everett saw her bloodless face and flinched. Mother, wait. She will only be confined long enough to reflect. Wrongdoing requires consequences. Julia looked at Everett. I told you I had nothing to do with this. Everett turned his back. If you did wrong, accept the punishment. I'll bring you out when you've reflected. The final hidden hope Julia had carried for him disappeared. They threw her into the narrow discipline room behind Warden House. Each day she curled beneath the tiny barred window and watched a small square of daylight move across the wall. 3 days passed without one visit from Everett. The food left outside had spoiled, and Julia could not force herself to eat. She watched the light and prayed for time to move faster. On the 4th night, someone tapped against the outer wall. Now you understand who matters to Everett. You were never going to defeat me. Lydia's satisfied voice slipped through the barred opening. Julia managed a weak smile and refused to argue. Don't think silence will save you. I'm never giving you another chance at my husband. Die in there, Julia. Lydia pushed burning straw through the opening. Fire spread across the dry floor. Julia crawled to the door and pounded until her hands split, but no one answered. She no longer knew how much time had passed when the door crashed inward. We are with Project 403. The research schedule moved forward, and transport leaves tonight. Intelligence will record you as a casualty of this fire, so your public identity can be sealed. A station officer supported Julia into the waiting vehicle. Once clear of the flames, she dragged air into her lungs. The truck began moving. Firelight receded in the mirror, and Julia finally lost consciousness. Just before darkness took her, the corner of her mouth lifted. From that moment on, she had another life. Goodbye, Everett. For good. The alarm bells at Warden House did not sound until well past midnight. By the time Everett burst through the rear gate, stripping off his heavy woolen overcoat to beat back the flames, the old wooden discipline shed was already in inferno. The dry timber, seasoned by decades of northern frost, roared like a furnace beneath the black sky. Water. Bring the yard pump. Everett screamed, his voice cracking into a ragged, desperate rasp. He lunged toward the padlocked door, his bare hands seizing the glowing iron hasp. The heat blistered his palms instantly, the scent of scorched flesh rising between his fingers, but he did not let go until Daniel Chase and 2 sentries tackled him back into the mud. Colonel, get back. The roof is collapsing. Let go of me, damn you. Jules is inside. Everett thrashed against his men with animal fury, his eyes bloodshot, veins bulging along his neck. Julia. Julia. A deafening crash answered him. The center beam snapped, showering the courtyard in a violent geyser of crimson sparks. The roof caved in, burying the interior under a mountain of blazing timber. When the fire was finally doused at dawn, nothing remained but a smoking crater of black charcoal and white ash. The military police investigator, accompanied by the county coroner, sifted through the smoldering debris with iron shovels. Near the back wall, beneath the fallen roof beam, they uncovered what remained: fragments of charred bone fused beyond recognition, and the melted silver casing of a small locket. Everett fell to his knees in the wet slurry of soot and ash. He reached out with trembling, raw hands and picked up the warped silver disc. It was the locket he had given her during their 3rd year together, the one he claimed held a lock of his hair, though he had never let her open the clasp. Colonel, the coroner said quietly, averting his eyes. The intensity of the blaze. There was no way anyone could have survived more than 2 minutes. The lack of oxygen alone would have ended it before the flames reached the far wall. Everett did not hear him. He clutched the blackened metal against his chest, his breath hitching into a dry, hollow sob that sounded like stone grinding on stone. She told me, he whispered, his head bowed until his forehead touched the mud. She told me she had nothing to do with Peter. She looked me in the eye, and I turned my back. Behind him, standing under the covered walkway, Lydia stood wrapped in a fine cashmere shawl, holding Peter's hand. Her lips were pressed into a thin, solemn line, but beneath the practiced sorrow in her eyes, a sharp gleam of satisfaction flickered. Everett, Lydia called softly, stepping forward with tears glistening on her cheeks. You must come inside. You will freeze out here. It was an accident. The dry straw must have caught from an old oil lamp. You cannot blame yourself. Everett slowly rose to his feet. He turned around. His face was smeared with black soot, his eyes completely bloodshot, his singed uniform hanging loose over his broad shoulders. When his gaze fell upon Lydia, there was no tenderness in it, only a dark, bottomless void that made her take an involuntary step backward. An oil lamp, Everett said, his voice terrifyingly calm. The discipline room has had no wiring or lamps for 10 years. The door was locked from the outside. Lydia's throat tightened. I only meant. Go back to your quarters, Everett said, cutting her off without raising his voice. Take the boy and get out of my sight. Estelle Warden stepped down from the veranda, her chin raised though her fingers fidgeted with her jade beads. Everett, watch how you speak to the mother of your son. That girl brought this misfortune upon herself. If she had not been so stubborn, if she had confessed to hiding Peter. Mother, Everett said, turning his deadened eyes onto the matriarch. Estelle froze. In all his 34 years, her son had never looked at her with such undisguised hatred. If you say another word about Julia, Everett whispered, every syllable, trembling with lethal restraint, I will have the military police escort you back to the ancestral estate in Oakhaven this afternoon, and you will never set foot in Fort Ashcombe again. Estelle gasped, pressing a hand to her chest, but the cold authority radiating from her son silenced her. Everett looked down at the handful of wet ash in his palm. The wind from the northern mountains swept through the courtyard, scattering the gray dust into the air until nothing was left. 900 miles to the northwest, beyond 3 military checkpoints and an endless expanse of virgin pine forests, lay Briar Ridge. The research station did not appear on any civilian map. To the outside world, it was merely Sector 403, an artillery testing range surrounded by high-voltage fencing and armed patrols. Beneath the snow-covered cliffs, however, lay a sprawling underground complex of reinforced concrete, humming generators, and white-tiled laboratories. In the medical bay of Sector 4, Julia opened her eyes. The sterile smell of carbolic acid and ethanol filled her senses. Above her, round industrial lamps cast a clean, steady white light. Don't try to sit up just yet, Dr. Fenner. An elderly man with silver-rimmed spectacles and a white lab coat pulled up a metal stool beside her bed. It was Professor Amos Bell, Chief Director of Project 403 and former Dean of the National Institute of Metallurgy. Professor Bell. Julia's voice was hoarse, her throat aching from smoke inhalation. You have been asleep for 48 hours, Bell said, handing her a glass of warm water with a glass straw. The field extraction team did an exceptional job. The fire at Fort Ashcombe destroyed the shed completely, and our intelligence officers planted suitable forensic biological material to close the civil registry file. He set a dark blue dossier on her bedside table. As of sunrise yesterday, Julia Fenner, teacher of Latchford Community School, is officially deceased. The death certificate has been signed by the county magistrate and filed with the War Department. Julia stared at the blue folder. Inside was her new identity, Dr. June Vance, lead research specialist, Department of Advanced Ballistic Alloys and High-Temperature Materials. She touched her chest. For 7 years she had felt a persistent, gnawing ache behind her ribs, the weight of waiting for a husband who only returned twice a year, the humiliation of being labeled barren, the suffocating guilt of believing she had failed the Warden family. Now lying in this cold, sunless room beneath the mountain, that ache was gone. There were no tears left to cry. The woman who had wept beneath the schoolhouse tree, who had run through the hospital corridors with scalded hands, who had begged a faithless man to believe her, that woman had burned to cinders in the courtyard of Warden House. When do I begin? Julia asked, her voice steady and clear. Professor Bell smiled, his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. Your recovery will take 2 weeks. The chemical burns on your palms need to heal, and your nutritional levels are severely depleted. My hands are fine, Julia said, lifting her bandaged palms. I can hold a slide rule. I can operate the spectrograph. Professor, I didn't come here to rest. I came here to work. Bell looked at her for a long moment, seeing the diamond-hard resolve forged in the fire of her betrayal. He nodded slowly. Very well. Project 403 is developing the high-heat structural alloy for the next generation of long-range interceptor missiles. The Western powers have established a complete blockade on tungsten-titanium composites. Our defense infrastructure depends on whether we can synthesize our own heat shield before the winter trials in 3 years. He stood up and opened the steel blast door of the medical ward, revealing the massive laboratory beyond. Dozens of engineers in gray coats were clustered around towering vacuum furnaces, blue electric arcs illuminating the concrete vault, slide rules clicking in unison like the rhythmic ticking of 1,000 clocks. Welcome to Briar Ridge, Dr. Vance, Bell said. Here, your work belongs to no single man. It belongs to the nation. Julia lowered her feet to the cold floor. When she stood, her knees trembled for a fraction of a second, then locked into place. She walked toward the light of the furnace. 3 years passed in the outside world, though at Fort Ashcombe time seemed to have curdled like sour milk. In the parlor of Warden House, the afternoon light revealed the fraying edges of the velvet curtains and the thick layer of dust on the mahogany sideboard. Nora Dawson, the housekeeper who had served Julia for years, had resigned 6 months after the fire, unable to bear the endless screaming matches between Lydia and Estelle. The new servants were lazy and careless, hired cheaply, because the Warden estate's finances had deteriorated rapidly. Everett, you cannot ignore this bill. Lydia slammed a leather ledger onto his desk in the study. Her once delicate features had sharpened into an expression of habitual grievance. She wore an expensive mink coat that ill-suited her narrow frame. Her fingers weighed down with heavy gold rings that had once belonged to Everett's grandmothers. The headmaster at St. Jude's Military Academy is demanding $500 for the repairs to the laboratory, Lydia complained, her voice grating on his nerves. They claim Peter set fire to the chemical storage. It's a lie. The other boys framed him because his father is a colonel. Everett did not look up from his tactical map. At 37, his hair had gone gray at the temples. A deep, permanent furrow was carved between his brows, and the smell of stale tobacco and black coffee followed him like a shadow. Peter is 9 years old, Everett said, his voice flat and deadened. Last term, he was expelled from Latchford for stabbing a classmate with a compass. Now he burns a laboratory. Do you expect me to use my rank to shield a delinquent? He is your son, Lydia shrieked. The only heir to the Warden name. You spend 6 months a year at the garrison, leaving me alone with your bitter mother, and when you come home, all you do is lock yourself in this room looking at that burnt piece of silver. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the corner of his desk. There, resting on a velvet cushion beneath a glass dome, was the warped silver locket retrieved from the ash, along with Julia's final teaching notebook and the splintered fragments of the wooden train Peter had smashed. Everett's hand moved instantly, his fingers wrapping around the hilt of his service sidearm on the desk. Step back from the desk, Lydia, he said softly. Lydia choked on her words. The cold, murderous stillness in his eyes terrified her. For 3 years, she had lived as the lawful mistress of Warden House, yet Everett had never once touched her. He slept in the barracks or on the narrow cot in his study. The grand marriage she had schemed 7 years to secure was nothing more than a tomb. You're a madman, Lydia whispered, backing toward the door. You grieve for a dead barren woman who couldn't even give you a child, while your living family rots before your eyes. She slammed the door. Everett did not move. He slowly lifted the glass dome, picked up the broken wooden train, and pressed the splintered cedar against his palm until the sharp edges broke the skin. I'll build you another train. All right? His own voice echoed in his memory, mocking him with its hollow arrogance. He had thought himself generous. He had thought himself a benevolent master who could balance 2 households, who could keep Julia tucked away like a precious songbird in a gilded cage while fulfilling his family's demand for bloodline and prestige. He had believed she would always be there, waiting under the schoolhouse tree, wiping away her tears with that gentle, forgiving smile. A knock sounded at the door. Daniel Chase entered, his expression unusually grave. Colonel, the War Department has issued new orders. Everett set the wood down and composed his face. Is it the transfer to the capital garrison? Chase hesitated. No, sir. The promotion board has suspended all capital appointments. General Vance's office has reassigned the 4th Brigade to the northern proving grounds at Iron Pass. We are to provide outer perimeter security for the National Defense Technological Summit. Everett frowned. Iron Pass. That is a desolate wasteland near the border. Why is the entire brigade being mobilized merely for guard duty? Because of Project 403, sir. Chase lowered his voice. Intelligence reports that the Briar Ridge Station has achieved a historic breakthrough in hypersonic thermal shielding. The chief scientist behind the project will be presenting the final test data to the Supreme Council at the proving grounds next week. Our brigade has been assigned to Absolute Level 1 lockdown. Everett rubbed his temples, a dull headache pulsing behind his eyes. Very well. Issue the mobilization orders. We move out at dawn. Iron Pass was a landscape of jagged granite and howling Arctic winds. 4 rings of barbed wire, heavy machine gun nests, and anti-aircraft batteries enclosed the vast expanse of the northern salt flats. Miles of black sensor cables snaked across the frozen earth, connecting the launch towers to the concrete bunkers of the command center. Colonel Everett Warden stood atop the observation platform, his collar turned up against the sleet, his binoculars trained on the landing strip. Below, high-ranking generals from the general staff, cabinet ministers, and foreign defense attaches from allied states were arriving in armored motorcades. The atmosphere was charged with an electric tension. Everyone knew that if today's live-fire test succeeded, the nation's strategic deterrence would leap forward by 2 decades. Convoy from Sector 403 approaching the main gate. The radio operator barked into his headset. Everett lowered his binoculars and descended to the security checkpoint. As brigade commander, It was his duty to personally inspect the credentials of every individual entering the inner control bunker. A convoy of 4 heavy armored transports, painted in matte olive drab with no divisional markings, ground to a halt before the steel gate. A squad of elite state security operatives in black coats and carrying submachine guns deployed instantly, forming a human cordon around the central vehicle. The rear door of the armored car opened. First to step out was Professor Amos Bell, now leaning on a cane, his chest adorned with the gold star of scientific merit. Everett stepped forward, offering a crisp military salute. Professor Bell. Colonel Everett Warden, 4th Brigade. The security perimeter is secure. It is an honor to receive you. Bell glanced at Everett's insignia, his eyes narrowing slightly behind his spectacles, but his voice remained entirely neutral. Thank you, Colonel. Please ensure your men maintain a 300-yard radius around the telemetry trailers. The chief specialist requires absolute concentration. Of course, Everett said. Where is the chief specialist? Right behind me. A woman stepped out from the interior of the transport. She wore a long, charcoal gray military research overcoat with the gold collar. Tabs of a tier, 1 national academician. Her dark hair was cut into a sharp, practical bob that framed high cheekbones and cool, luminous eyes. A pair of white leather technical gloves covered her hands, holding a heavy steel document cylinder stamped with red wax. She did not look at the generals. She did not look at the soldiers standing at attention. She stepped onto the frozen gravel, her boots clicking with absolute authority, her breath misting in the freezing mountain air. Everett's salute froze in midair. The blood in his veins seemed to turn to liquid nitrogen. His heart gave one violent, agonizing thud against his ribs, and then stopped entirely. The world around him lost all color and sound. The roar of the Arctic wind, the rumble of the diesel generators, the voices of his aides, all of it faded into a deafening, high-pitched ringing. Jules. The name slipped from his lips before his mind could comprehend the madness of it. The woman stopped. She turned her head slightly, her gaze passing over the armed guards, over the sandbags, and resting upon the tall, gray-haired colonel standing before her. Her eyes were completely clear. There was no hatred in them. There was no pain. There was no shock. Looking into her eyes was like looking into the surface of an ancient, frozen lake, deep, beautiful, and utterly devoid of life for him. Colonel Warden, she said, her voice smooth, low, and perfectly modulated. Your men are blocking the entrance to the telemetry trailer. Please clear the corridor. Everett took a step forward, his hands shaking so violently that his gloves brushed against his holster. Julia, it's you. My God, you're alive. You're alive. Clack. 4 submachine guns were raised simultaneously. The state security captain stepped directly between Everett and the woman, the muzzle of his weapon pressing hard against Everett's chest armor. Officer, step back, the captain commanded, his voice cold as iron. You are within the prohibited radius of a Tier 1 state asset. Another step will be treated as an act of treason. Stand down, Captain, Julia said calmly, not even blinking at the drawn weapons. The colonel is merely disoriented by the cold. Jules, listen to me. Everett's voice broke into a desperate, strangled plea. Ignored the gun barrels pointed at his throat, trying to peer over the captain's shoulder. I thought you burned. I found the locket. I buried you with my own hands. Julia, I spent 3 years. Colonel Warden, Professor Bell interrupted, his voice ringing with chilling authority across the tarmac. You are addressing Dr. June Vance, Chief Engineer of the National Defense Materials Commission. Dr. Vance has served at Briar Ridge since the inception of Project 403. If you persist in this delusional harassment, I will have General Vance relieve you of command immediately. She is my wife. Everett roared, his eyes bloodshot, veins pulsing at his temples. Her name is Julia Fenner. She taught at Latchford. Look at her, look at the scar on her shoulder from where she took a blade for me. Julia did not flinch. She adjusted the document cylinder under her arm, looked at Professor Bell, and spoke in the tone of someone discussing the weather. Professor, the atmospheric pressure is dropping. If we do not calibrate the telemetry sensors within 20 minutes, the telemetry data for the terminal re-entry phase will be compromised. Quite right, Dr. Vance. Let us proceed. Julia turned her back on Everett. She walked up the concrete steps of the command bunker, surrounded by her security detail, without looking back a single time. The heavy steel blast doors swung shut behind her with a deep, resonant thud, the pneumatic locks hissing as they sealed the interior. Everett lunged forward, but Daniel Chase and 2 sentries threw their arms around him, dragging him backward across the frozen gravel. Colonel, for God's sake, stop! Chase hissed in terror, looking at the stone-faced security operatives who were already unbuttoning their sidearms. That is the chief scientist of Project 403. If you touch her, the general staff will have you court-martialed and shot before sundown. It was her Chase. Everett wept, tears carving pale tracks through the dust on his cheeks. Did you not see her eyes? That was Julia. She didn't die, she ran. Away she left me. Even if it were her, Chase whispered, his voice trembling with grim reality. Julia Fenner was a civilian teacher from a country town whose marriage records with you were never registered with the military command. Dr. June Vance is a national hero who holds a direct security clearance from the Supreme Council to the state colonel. Julia Fenner does not exist. Everett went limp in their grip. He stared at the massive steel blast doors, the cold realization settling into his bones with the weight of a lead tombstone. She had not died in the fire. She had used the fire to erase him. She had chosen to spend years underground in a windowless research bunker, working until her fingers were raw, rather than spend another single day as his secret, subordinate wife. Inside the command bunker, through the reinforced observation glass, Julia stood before the main control console. Dozens of monitors glowed with green telemetry streams. On the main tactical screen, the countdown reached 3 minutes. Dr. Vance, the launch director, called out. Target acquisition confirmed. Ignition sequence in 10-9-8. Julia picked up the red authorization key, inserted it into the master console, and turned it with a steady, unyielding hand. Ignition, she commanded. Through the heavy concrete, a low, earth-shaking rumble rose from the salt flats. Across the desert, the interceptor missile tore into the gray sky on a pillar of blinding orange fire, piercing the cloud layer and vanishing into the stratosphere at 8 times the speed of sound. 2 minutes later, the telemetry speakers crackled with static, followed by a triumphant roar from the radar station. Direct hit. Heat shield integrity at 100%. Temperature. Dissipation optimal. The alloy held. The entire command bunker erupted into deafening cheers. Generals embraced. Engineers, technical drafts were thrown into the air like confetti. Professor Bell grasped Julia's hand, his eyes moist with pride. We did it. Jing. The border is secure. Julia looked out through the glass toward the high altitude where the white smoke trail lingered against the blue sky. Below, standing in the freezing sleep by the perimeter wire, Everett Warden was still watching the bunker, a small, broken silhouette against the vast, indifferent desert. Julia smiled faintly, released the authorization key, and picked up her clipboard. Prepare the data sets for the second phase, she said to her team. We have work to do. The post-trial reception was held in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Iron Pass garrison. Under the harsh brilliance of the crystal chandeliers, the highest echelons of the military and scientific establishment gathered to celebrate the triumph of Project 403. Silver trays of champagne circulated among uniformed officers, but the center of all attention was the small circle surrounding Dr. June Vance. Everett stood in the shadow of the colonnade, having bypassed his own security duties to stand near the ballroom entrance. His dress uniform was unbuttoned at the collar, his eyes hollow, clutching a crystal glass of whiskey that he had not tasted. Every time Julia laughed softly at a remark from the Minister of Defense, Everett's chest seized with an agony so acute he could barely breathe. 7 years. For 7 years, he had kept her in that quiet house in Latchford, telling her that the world outside was too harsh, that she was too delicate, that she must wait for him in the shadows. He had treated her like a dependent who owed everything to his protection. Now she stood among men who commanded armies, her intellect commanding their total reverence, radiating a brilliant, unassailable dignity that made his colonel's epaulets look like children's toys. When the Minister of Defense stepped away to take an urgent telephone call, Everett saw his chance. He shoved past 2 aides and crossed the floor with long, desperate strides. Julia, he choked out, reaching for her arm. Before his fingers could graze her sleeve, 2 plainclothes security guards stepped smoothly into his path, their shoulders blocking him like a wall of stone. Colonel Warden, the lead guard warned in a low, dangerous tone. Step back. Immediately. Julia turned around slowly. She held a glass of mineral water in her left hand. Her posture relaxed, looking at him with that same impenetrable, polite calm. Let me speak to her for 5 minutes, Everett begged, ignoring the guards, his voice cracking with humiliation in front of the entire assembly. Jules, just 5 minutes. I know what I did. I know about the marriage papers. I know about Lydia. I know you took the abortion. A sudden deadly silence rippled through the nearby officers. Several generals turned their heads, their expressions darkening. Everett dropped to one knee on the polished marble floor, heedless of his rank, heedless of the 50 pairs of eyes watching him. I was blind, Jules. My mother pressured me. The family needed an heir. I thought I could protect you from the shame of being barren. I thought if I kept you safe in Latchford, we could still have our life together. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks, dripping onto the gold braid of his cuffs. When you died in that fire, half of my soul died with you. I haven't slept in 3 years. I haven't touched Lydia. I keep your broken train on my desk every night. Punish me. Strike me, have me demoted to a private, but don't look at me as if I am a stranger. Please tell them who I am. The ballroom was so quiet that the faint hum of the chandeliers was audible. Julia looked down at the man kneeling at her feet. She looked at his gray hair, at his trembling hands, at the medals on his chest, that she had once polished with a soft flannel cloth by the lamplight in Latchford. She remembered the freezing mud of the courtyard when Estelle slapped her. She remembered the smoke filling the discipline shed while Lydia laughed outside the bars. She remembered lying on the cold operating table while Mabel held her hand, saying goodbye to the only child she would ever carry. There was no rage in her heart. There was only a vast, clean emptiness. Security officer, Julia said softly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. Yes, Dr. Vance? Julia took a sip of her water, set the glass on a passing waiter's tray, and looked at the guards. I do not know this officer. He appears to be suffering from severe combat fatigue and acute mental instability. Please have him removed from the venue so he does not disrupt the state guests. Everett looked up, his face draining of all color until he looked like a corpse. Julia, no. Please. Dr. Vance, the Minister of Defense said, returning to the circle and casting a look of utter disgust at the kneeling colonel. Is this man troubling you? Not at all, Minister, Julia replied with a professional smile. A minor misunderstanding regarding security protocol. Shall we discuss the alloy specifications for the maritime fleet? Of course. This way, Doctor. 2 security officers seized Everett by his armpits, hauling him to his feet and dragging him backward toward the side exit. His boots scuffed against the marble, his hands reaching out uselessly toward the receding circle of light where Julia stood, her back turned to him, moving forward into a future where he did not occupy a single grain of dust. The incident at the reception was not dismissed as a mere breach of etiquette. When an active duty brigade commander suffers a public psychological breakdown and attempts to accost the chief architect of the nation's premier defense program, the State Security Bureau does not simply file a reprimand. They open a level 1 counterintelligence dossier. Within 48 hours, a special investigative team from the General Staff's Internal Affairs Division arrived at Fort Ashcombe and Latchford. They did not speak to Everett. They seized every record, every telegram, every bank account, and every registry ledger associated with Warden House. In the interrogation room of the Capitol Military Prison, Everett sat under the harsh glare of an overhead metal lamp. Opposite him sat General Marcus Vance, Director of Military Justice and elder brother of Professor Bell. Marcus tossed a thick, brown folder onto the steel table between them. Colonel Everett Warden, Marcus began, his voice dry and clinical. Over the past 48 hours, our investigators have uncovered an extraordinary pattern of criminal misconduct spanning the last 8 years. Everett sat motionless, his wrists handcuffed to the iron ring on the table. Item 1. Marcus read, turning a page. In October of 7 years ago you utilized a forged municipal seal to issue a fraudulent civilian marriage certificate to one Julia Fenner, while maintaining an active, lawful military dependent record for Lydia Cruz Warden. Under the Military Penal Code, this constitutes felony bigamy and fraudulent falsification of state civil documents. Everett closed his eyes. Item 2. For 6 years, you diverted $3,000 annually from the 4th Brigade's Logistical Contingency Fund to maintain a private residence in Latchford under an assumed name. Item 3. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes fixing on Everett with absolute contempt. The fire at the Warden House discipline shed on the night of November 14th. Everett's head snapped up. The fire was an accident. Was it? Marcus pulled a signed confession from the folder. Yesterday morning, our officers interrogated your lawful wife, Lydia Warden. Under standard counterintelligence questioning, she broke down within 20 minutes. Marcus slid the document across the table. Lydia Warden has confessed to purchasing 10 liters of industrial kerosene from the Garrison Motor Pool on the afternoon of November 14th. She has confessed to personally throwing burning straw and kerosene through the barred window of the discipline room with the explicit intent to commit premeditated murder. Everett felt the room tilt violently beneath him. No, she said, she told me. It was an oil lamp. And your mother, Estelle Warden, Marcus continued relentlessly, was fully aware of the plot. She paid $50 to the night sentry to ensure the rear courtyard was abandoned between midnight and 2 in the morning. Marcus slammed the folder shut. You harbored murderers. You used your rank to intimidate Nurse Mabel Quinn when she attempted to report your domestic fraud. You abused a woman who lost her fertility saving your worthless life on the southern border, allowed your family to frame her for kidnapping, locked her in a shed without food, and stood by while your wife tried to incinerate her. I didn't know, Everett screamed, rattling his chains against the iron ring, tears of bloodshot fury bursting from his eyes. I swear to God I didn't know. Lydia set the fire. I tried to pull Julia out. Look at my hands. He held up his scarred, blistered palms. Marcus Vance did not even look at them. Your ignorance is not a defense, Colonel. It is the proof of your cowardice. You wanted the prestige of an heir, the social respectability of your mother's lineage, and the pure devotion of a woman who adored you. You were too weak to choose, so you built a fortress of lies and let the women in your house burn each other to ashes. Marcus stood up, gathering his papers. The military tribunal has reached its verdict. Your rank is stripped. Your pension and military honors are permanently revoked. You are sentenced to 15 years of hard labor at the Iron Pass border quarry. And Lydia? Everett choked out. Lydia Warden has been sentenced to death by firing squad for attempted murder and treasonous endangerment of a state scientist, Marcus said coldly. Estelle Warden has been stripped of all state subsidies and sentenced to 8 years in the Provincial Women's Penitentiary. Marcus walked to the heavy iron door, paused, and looked back over his shoulder. As for your son, Peter, he has been remanded to the state reformatory for juvenile delinquents. At his intake interview yesterday, when informed of his mother's arrest, he told the warden that he only wished he had burned the schoolhouse down while the teachers were inside. The iron door slammed shut. The heavy bolt shot home with a sound like a rifle firing. Everett sat alone in the pool of white light, his forehead resting against the cold steel of the table, his weeping echoing off the concrete walls until his voice gave out entirely. The winter at Iron Pass was long, merciless, and gray. In the granite quarry 6 miles north of the main fortress, the prisoners worked in chain gangs, their sledgehammers striking the frozen rock with a rhythmic, hollow clatter. Everett wore a coarse canvas prison tunic stamped with a black numeral across the back. His hands, once accustomed to fine leather reins and ceremonial swords, were cracked, blackened with rock dust, and covered in frostbite sores. His back was bent, his face gaunt, his teeth loose from scurvy. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, the roar of jet engines would echo across the mountain pass. Everett would stop his hammer. He would lean against the cold granite wall, wipe the sweat and rock dust from his eyes, and look up toward the narrow strip of sky between the cliffs. A sleek, silver transport aircraft, bearing the blue insignia of the National Science Commission, would cut through the clouds, soaring effortlessly over the jagged peaks, flying toward the capital where honors, banquets, and historical glory awaited its passengers. Inside that silver bird sat Dr. June Vance. She would be reviewing technical charts, sipping tea, perhaps looking out the small oval window at the white expanse of the northern mountains below, her mind occupied with equations that would protect millions of lives for generations to come. She would not look at the quarry. She would not know that among the gray stones, a broken man in chains was staring up at the vapor trail she left behind. And even if she had looked down, she would have seen only the endless, pristine snow, clean and white, covering the ancient scars of the earth until nothing remained of the fire that had once burned there. Everett watched the silver speck vanish into the vast blue horizon. A guard's whip cracked against his shoulder. Number 408. Back to work. Everett did not flinch from the blow. He slowly lifted his heavy iron hammer, swung it with the last strength left in his withered arms, and struck the stone. Clang. The rock shattered. The dust rose and was instantly carried away by the Arctic wind. 5 years later, the spring at Briar Ridge arrived late, but when it came, the alpine meadows erupted into a sea of brilliant yellow buttercups and wild blue irises. On the open terrace of the newly constructed High Energy Physics Institute, overlooking the valley, Julia sat in a wicker chair, a cup of fresh jasmine tea, resting on the small wooden table beside her. Beside her, Professor Amos Bell, now fully retired and wearing a comfortable tweed cardigan, was pruning a small potted pine. The State Council approved the new Aerospace Academy this morning, Bell said, snipping a stray needle with his shears. They want to name the Central Laboratory after you, June. Julia smiled, leaning back against the cushions, feeling the gentle mountain sun warm her face. Tell them to name it after the team, Professor. Science is never the work of one person. Still as modest as the day you arrived with blisters on your hands, Bell chuckled. He looked at her thoughtfully. Do you ever think about the South, June? About Latchford? Julia took a sip of her tea. She looked out across the valley where the pine forest stretched endlessly, toward the snow-capped horizon. The air was clean, carrying the scent of melting snow and damp earth. In her memory, the small town of Latchford, the classroom with its squeaking chalk, the tree by the gate, The man with the dark stubble who made promises he never intended to keep. All of it felt like a book she had read in her childhood. Its pages faded and yellowed with age. No, Julia said softly, her voice filled with a deep, unbreakable serenity. That was another life. That woman died long ago. She set her cup down, stood up, and walked to the stone balustrade of the terrace. The wind from the northern peaks caught her hair, lifting it gently around her face. Before her lay the boundless sky, vast, open and brilliant, untouched by any shadow, belonging entirely to the morning light.